Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. Now that so many more details about the biggest shooting rampage in modern US history have surfaced, the burning question is, could anything have been done to prevent this crime? In particular, if gun laws were stricter, could 23-year-old Cho Seung-Hyu have walked into a gun shop in Southern Virginia 5 weeks earlier, bought a pistol and ammunition with his credit card, and later used it to kill more than 30 people? Our correspondent Rob Reynolds has been following events down in Blacksburg, Virginia, and he's been taking a look at the aftermath. This is what he found.
In hindsight, there were too many signs that 23-year-old Cho Seung-Hyu was a human time bomb waiting to explode. High school and college classmates say Cho had no friends, rarely spoke, was sullen and alienated. In a drama class at Virginia Tech, Cho wrote plays filled with extreme violence, grotesque imagery of killings with chainsaws and hammers. The writing so horrified a teacher, she reported Cho to university police.
I felt I needed to pull him from the class because I didn't feel comfortable with his being with the students.
Police even took Cho for psychiatric evaluation after complaints from a female student.
A temporary detention order was obtained and Cho was taken to a mental health facility.
But despite all the warning signs, nothing prevented Cho from walking into this gun shop last month and buying a Glock 19 semi-automatic pistol and 50 rounds of ammunition.
Cho did legally purchase these weapons in accordance with Virginia law.
Virginia has one of the least restrictive gun laws in America. All Cho had to do was present two forms of identification showing he was a Virginia resident. The gun shop owner ran a criminal and mental health background check. After 30 minutes, Cho was cleared to buy the weapon. Each year, an average of 11,000 people in America are killed by guns. In Blacksburg, people are pondering whether it is time for America to reassess its long love affair with the right to bear arms.
Well, Rob Reynolds joins us now from Blacksburg, Virginia. Rob, what is it like there now, 2 days after this incident?
Very quiet, Anand. A lot of the students have left. Classes, of course, have been canceled through the end of the week. All day yesterday, you saw little groups of students with their backpacks and rolling baggage carts being ushered into cars by anxious parents. So it's a very quiet day here today. There's still periodic updates by the police and the university authorities. The highlight today, if you will, if that's the right term, is the revelation that at one point in late 2005, Cho, the man who police believe was the killer, was actually taken to a mental health facility and checked out at the request of the police. But as we know, nothing really came of that. His treatment, if there was any, certainly was not sufficient to harness his inner demons.
All right, Rob. Thank you. Rob Reynolds there joining us from Blacksburg in Virginia. Now, joining us to discuss the social and legal implications of the school rampage are two top experts in their respective fields. In New York, Catherine Newman is a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University and author of Rampage, The Social Roots of School Shootings. And in Tallahassee, Florida, is Gary Kleck, a professor of criminology at Florida State University. He wrote Point Blank, Guns and Violence in America, which concluded, despite his earlier leanings, that gun ownership has a more positive effect than negative effect on society. Don't forget, we also take your questions and comments on the show. You can call us at the numbers at the bottom there on your screen. Professor Kleck, I'd like to start with you. And, well, as I just mentioned, you have a somewhat unconventional view of gun control. You believe that a proliferation in legal gun ownership has actually led to less crime. That is unconventional because at one time you believed very strongly in very strong gun control.
Well, no, that's not quite correct. I think the availability of guns has no net effect, zero net effect on violence, and that's because guns in the hands of violence-prone people has a violence-elevating effect, while guns in the hands of people whose only involvement in crime would be as victims has a violence-reducing effect. And it's not really a very unusual position among criminologists to believe that victims who use guns for self-protection are less likely to be injured. So the implication is you ought to do what you can to keep guns away from the high-risk individuals, but not at the cost of taking them away from future crime victims who could use them to save their own lives or prevent injury.
But the conventional view has been that there's been more crime because guns are freely available. That is a conventional view.
And if it had been qualified to say more guns among violence-prone people, people who independent of their gun ownership were violence-prone, then that would be a correct position. But repeatedly we found that increases in gun ownership or higher levels of gun ownership in one area versus another just don't have the effect of elevating the violence rates.
Okay, let's turn to Professor Catherine Newman there in New York. Professor Newman, your book, The Social Roots of School Shootings, has some interesting findings. You found, for instance, that contrary to popular theories, no shooter suddenly snapped and had some kind of psychotic outrage that led to the kind of incident that we saw at Virginia Tech.
That's right, and I think this is actually a textbook case. You can see from the trail of records that this is a young man who was troubled and was on many radar screens for several years before this incident. And that is not unusual at all, because it's not a quick break. It's a long-planned assault, I'm afraid.
You know, the other thing is that an incident like the one that took place in Blacksburg, Virginia, I mean, it took place in a remote, somewhat remote, relatively remote rural area. And is that a factor that you found common to other incidents like that?
I have. Now, Blacksburg is actually a big city by comparison to the places I studied. Most American school shootings take place in extremely small, very remote towns. The ones I studied had populations like 2,200. Blacksburg is a larger community than that, but it's still fairly far away from big cities where a greater diversity of social types might be available, and a marginal boy who's having difficulty finding his niche may find greater comfort in a larger city. But I think this young man's troubles were way beyond that.
And did you also find that the things that may have led him to carry out this particular act were found in other individuals as well?
Yes, most of the people that we studied had a history of mental illness, which was difficult to detect, especially if they were quite young. But if we backtrack enough and look for the signs, we can see often trails of deep depression, difficulty managing peer relationships, a tendency to be oddball, or in some cases jokesters and pranksters, in other cases morbid and withdrawn. But these are always people who have great difficulty managing their peer relations, and they come to be defined publicly by others as losers, and they want to go out in a blaze of glory that will redefine who they are in the public eye into something much more alluring and notorious.
And is it a particularly unique American phenomenon, or have you found instances of this in other countries as well?
No, they happen in other countries as well. In fact, up until a couple of days ago with this shooting, the worst case on record was in Erfurt, Germany. And we have had cases around the world. It's not a unique American phenomenon, but it does seem to happen here more often, certainly more often than we would like.
Professor Clegg, looking at the research that you have done, have you found any figures about this particular type of violence, violence that is perpetrated in schools in America?
Despite these incidents, which happen occasionally, a couple of times a year, of large-scale shootings in schools, schools nevertheless remain what people traditionally believed them to be. They're safe havens. They really are very, very safe. So if you simply calculated the number of homicides per 100,000 people resident, you'd find much lower rates in college campuses, which is exactly what you would expect, given that they are predominantly middle-class populations, and middle-class violence is unusual. This incident is unrepresentative of violence in virtually every respect you can imagine.
Okay, let's get a call in from one of our viewers. Earl in Michigan is calling. Earl, go ahead with your call.
Yes, I appreciate the time. My question is, once the shooter was instituted, I mean, when they put him in the mental hospital, why come this information wasn't forwarded to the FBI? Because when you buy a gun, they have a question: have you ever had mental illness? Now, if the FBI would have had this information on this kid's record, he would have never been able to purchase these pistols.
Right. Oh, okay. I'm not so sure that he was actually put into a mental institution. Though he was, there was recommendations that he be referred to one, I think, but I don't think he was put in one. Let me put that question to Professor Newman. Could that have prevented this happening?
Well, I think it depends on how carefully gun sellers check the records, but I think you're right that I don't believe he was ever checked into a mental facility. I think he was referred for evaluation, and we don't even know how far that got. We do have some fail-safe information that's supposed to stop someone from being able to purchase a gun, even in the state of Virginia, but it didn't seem to work this time, and that may be because he didn't really complete an evaluation that would have triggered a record.
Most states don't have these registries for mentally ill people for use in gun checks, and the few that do only cover those who are institutionalized, which the shooter was not. And there's good reasons why states have been reluctant to come up with government lists of crazy people, to put it bluntly. People would be discouraged from seeking treatment if they knew that was one of the consequences of doing so.
Professor Clark, have you found in your research that there is a difference between the kind of gratuitous criminal violence, which involves guns, and that involving domestic violence?
Well, certainly the kind of incident we've just seen is extraordinarily different. It was clearly planned, and it was done by a person who clearly didn't care about any of the risks involved. Not only didn't care about whether he would get caught, didn't even care if he died. Obviously, the incident ended with him taking his own life, and that's common for mass shooters. They take their own life, or they put themselves in a position where they're killed by police. Whereas ordinary killers ordinarily do have a rational element such that they do care about self-preservation, and certainly the average domestic violence offender can be deterred partly because he wants to stay alive. He may be angry at the person he's inflicting violence on, but it doesn't mean he's forgotten completely about the issue of self-preservation.
Professor Newman, we have an email here from Kat, who's in Idaho in the United States, and it goes to the state of mind of the person who is thought to have caused this. It says, I think this man had some kind of brain disorder which caused him to commit the crimes at the school. So no, I do not think gun control is the answer. If it wasn't a gun, it would have been a bomb.
We will not know anything very definitive about this person's state of mind for some time, and we may never have a complete picture. There seems to be plenty of evidence of significant depression, behavior that frightened other people around him, a kind of withdrawn person who had great trouble communicating with others. Whether that was a brain disorder or not, I have no idea. I don't think anybody knows.
But I think what the is the viewer here trying to make the point that the gun was actually the irrelevant issue, that this person was out to go and kill, so whether it was a gun or whether he used some other thing like a bomb.
Well,
was
there's more than one way to kill a large number of people. I
Right.
wouldn't disagree with that. The fact that he used a gun led to the numbers of shootings that we saw, but yes, of course, you could achieve the same ends in other ways. I think that what happens with school shooters, at least what my research suggests, is that they have a certain kind of template or script, if you like, for what produces a more notorious, alluring character, almost as if they're in a drama. And we don't have too many examples of anti-heroes who are just heaving bombs at innocent people, but we do have, unfortunately, examples in popular culture of people using guns to achieve those ends. And at least in the shooters I've studied, this is a script that they are looking to instantiate, because the other script, the one they live with, is of a loser and often a weakling, and this is quite intolerable to them.
On the other hand, the police did, according to one news report, find plans for making bombs in the shooter's
well,
dorm room.
sometimes shooters do that. They do both.
And
I don't think it really matters very much, to be honest.
And it was preceded by a series of bomb threats. They haven't connected the bomb threats to this shooter, but if he was responsible for those, then it means he was already considering alternative ways of killing large numbers of people.
I'm not sure it really matters very much at this point.
Well, it matters if you argue that the only way he could have killed large numbers of people is with guns.
I just said there are many ways you could kill large numbers of people.
Right, but there's large numbers of people who wouldn't agree with you on that point.
Well, maybe, but I don't think
I'm
they would
speaking
make
to
much sense.
that audience, basically.
Okay, Professor Newman, let me ask you this. What about society in general? Have we in some way glorified this type of criminal behavior?
We see in popular culture images of masculinity that are attached to violence. We see characters like Rambo, and we often glorify their power. The side consequence of this can be for young men who feel like they're failing in terms of their masculine images to see that as superior to the alternative for them. And the alternative for them is weakness, inability to play sports or be successful with girls, the kinds of attributes that we commonly associate with masculinity in adolescence. So to say that we've glorified it is a bit of a misnomer. It's in comparison to what? And for these young men, it's in comparison to a self-image that they find they can't live with.
Professor Clark, we just have a little time left, but I was looking at your study and looking at some of the conclusions that you reached, but you found that generally gun violence has been on the decrease over the last decade or so, last 2 decades.
From 91 to 99, it declined by about 1/3, and it's been flat since 1999. So often these extraordinary acts of violence occur in a context of declining or unchanging violence. This isn't part of a larger trend, although the media often look for trends. In this case, it's contrary to the trend.
All right, so that's where we have to leave it. Professor Gary Clark talking to us there from Tallahassee in Florida. Professor Catherine Newman talking to us from New York. Thank you both for joining us.
My pleasure.
You're welcome.
Now, on the next show, we talk about political censorship in America and the play My Name is Rachel Corrie. The play is based on the words of an American peace activist crushed to death 4 years ago by an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza. It ran in London to rave reviews, but when it moved to New York last year, the theatre that was supposed to run it cancelled it, citing its controversial nature. Now, a theatre in Seattle, Washington, is hosting the play. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send us your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll be seeing you next time. Street Talk is next.